So it looks like we're approaching that point where a conversation probably should start being had about Thomas Frank, because that was, again, a really, really just terrible performance. And it's one that we've sort of become accustomed to this season. Um, but yeah, let's get straight into Tottenham 1, Fulham 2. So this is how Thomas Frank lined up in this game. Obviously, after the game against PSG, we've seen just how deadly we can be in attack, and I guess his sort of thinking here was that you've seen the way that Muani and Richarlison sort of operated together, and sort of thought, maybe that would be sort of a good source of our attacks. We didn't see it too much. Richarlison really played more of this sort of wide role, unlike Kudus, where Kudus would get the ball and he'd sort of go wide and he'd really look to like stretch the pitch, go to the touchline. Don't really see that from Richarlison when he plays. It's more of like just having sort of another striker who's slightly more towards the left. Just in terms of the the sort of lineup, I was a bit disappointed Odegaard wasn't in there. Particularly disappointed that Xavi Simons wasn't there, because if what we're taken away from Wednesday's result was, yes, we did concede 5 goals and ultimately dropped points twice in the same game from winning positions. The attack was the best bit about Wednesday night, and you sort of thought with the sorts of players, I guess, Xavi Simons and Odegaard didn't really play, so you could maybe say that he's rewarding the likes of Richarlison and Muani and then bringing in Kudus. But, with the sort of lineup that we had, I guess it all just sort of come crashing down pretty soon after that. So, yeah, again, it's one of those where we just hit self-destruct straight away, and it's just not surprising at all. And the first goal, yes, it is something that's sort of been highlighted quite a lot. I've seen over on social media, there's been a lot of stuff about saying how sort of vulnerable we are from conceding from the edge of the box, and that theme continued. Yes, it was a bit of a lucky break the way it fell to Tete, but immediately, I think it was about 3 minutes in, and you're down, and then you've got, what is usually in any sort of game quite a big task of coming from behind to win, but it just feels like there's just added pressure given the circumstances, given our recent form, some of the sorts of, discontent that the fans have mentioned under Thomas Frank, and, that's bad enough. And then the second goal was just, it sometimes, when you're watching Spurs, things just happen and you just don't react. And that was just one of those moments where Vicario comes steaming out. There's a couple of times where the ball was coming over down Fulham's left-hand side, really, really testing Porro in between sort of him and Danso, and they got on a few times from that. And I think it was, they tried this sort of, that same similar sort of ball, and Vicario come out, and you're just thinking, okay, if you can find a pass, great, but just get rid of it. And it's one of them where all he needs to do is just put a little bit of height on that, even if it's just enough just to push Fulham back 5 or 10 yards as a defence, then he's got time to get back to his goal. But he just got it all wrong, and it was just sort of befitting of the team at the minute. I think we all just look a bit confused. We don't really know where we're meant to be in terms of, in an attacking sense, and I guess you could even say in a defensive sense. We just look completely lost at the minute, and it's worrying because with Frank, some of the major concern really has been about how sort of toothless we've looked in attack, but the defence is supposed to be his strong, his what he builds his team off is his defence, and it looked like he laid some defensive foundations earlier on in the season, but for whatever reason, those foundations just seem to have crumbled, especially in this last week. That's now 11 goals conceded in 3 games. And you're looking at it and you're watching and you're thinking, the 7 minutes gone and the game's pretty much over for Spurs. And with some of the recent fixtures we've had, Newcastle away in the League Cup, we've had Arsenal away, we've had Chelsea at home, we've had United at home, we've had Paris Saint-Germain away. You know, you can sort of expect it in those sorts of games when we're probably not as far along in terms of, ideally challenging for, the big honours. In comparison to those teams, you can sort of, I guess there's a bit of context which you need, as frustrating as last Sunday was when we got absolutely, hammered by Arsenal. You sort of go, okay, they're a lot further along in their development. They're a lot closer to where they want to be than we are. So naturally, they're a better team than us. Fulham have not been a good team this season. Fulham have been struggling. And I said in the last video that they've sort of sleepwalked into the sort of relegation conversation. Well, they've just sort of, used us to get out of that conversation now. And it's not the first time that's happened this season. We've seen it against Wolves at home, where we put in an absolutely terrible performance, couldn't break teams down. It was just, getting the ball out to Kudus and Porro and just sort of hitting crosses into the box. And it didn't work. It particularly didn't work in the first half, where we tried 17 crosses into the box. That was our only sort of chance creation, and none of them were met by a Tottenham head. It just shows that we are just absolutely clueless in attack, in the sense that we don't know what to try other than, just these hopeful crosses towards the back post, which more often than not don't work out for us. And it's really, really frustrating. And it feels like if we seen, different ways we can play on a more consistent basis. So far under Thomas Frank, you'd say, okay, maybe the way we're playing's not working at the minute, but we've got something else that we can revert to. But at the minute, we just look completely lost. And it feels like as soon as you put 1 foot forward, you take 3 or 4 back at the minute. And I really, really don't see how we're getting out of this at the minute, given our current situation. And I don't see how Thomas Frank changes, and how we go from this sort of point that we're at now to maybe 6 months down the line where things are looking better. And yes, we'll have players back, but it's more to do with the sort of the football that we play, and the sort of image of Tottenham in Thomas Frank's head. What does that look like? And at the minute, we've not seen anything that would hint towards that. And I said it before that it's sort of like purgatory, and it sort of is in that sense, because you're going into the games and you're thinking, well, I know it's not going to be, probably not going to be an amazing watch. There's always the lingering fear that we could get absolutely turned over, but I'm just struggling to feel anything at the minute with this team, because I've not seen anything really that I feel like I could hang my hat on, which would make me feel like, yeah, things are bad for now, but once this happens, we'll be back on track. And yes, injuries are depleting the team at the minute, but the players that we've got available, we've seen lesser teams playing better football, picking up more points than us recently, with lesser squads than us on paper. And I don't think those managers, when they went into their teams, were thinking, well, I need all of these sorts of things just to pick up points. Because at the minute, it's one thing if we're not playing this good football and it's a bit of a tough watch. Ultimately, if you're picking up points, that sort of softens the blow, but we're not doing that in the minute. And I'm really, really struggling to see where we are at the end of the season. If it's Frank, and if it's not, who is it? But this was a game that we had to win, and we didn't ever look like winning it. And ultimately, from the 3rd minute, we're chasing the game, and that is just not good enough, considering recent results, considering how bad our home form's been, considering how bad Fulham's away form's been. And I'm really, really struggling to see how we get out of this sort of rut that we're in at the minute. So earlier this week, Alistair Gold, I won't say pressed, but he asked Thomas Frank about one of Thomas Frank's first initial quotes as Tottenham Hotspur manager, where Frank basically said, by not taking risks, that's you opening yourself up to more risks. So essentially, you take risks by not taking risks. That's, this is verbatim, but this is what he said. He said, if they don't think we do, I think we do. Maybe we should do more. I think it's fair to ask the questions. We're not creating enough chances, which is a perfectly valid response. But what I would say to that, Thomas, what I would say, and this is not an attack on you personally, but there is something that I do need to share with you. 0.001 xg. That was, not something that I've been familiar with before, ever really seen it, even as, sort of a football fan. Chelsea at home, Arsenal in the first half, Fulham in the first half. That is 3 of, I think, our last 4 or 5 games where that's happened. How is that not? How do you not see that that's, that we are playing with the handbrake on and we need to take more risks? And I come back to last night's game, 2-0 down at home, as a manager who's not really built up much of a rapport with the fans. Your time to earn your stripes is now. That's the time to be a bit ballsy. And, as we're kicking off the second half, I'm thinking, why is Wilson Odobert still on the bench? Why is Richarlison still on the pitch? Why is Xavi Simons not on the pitch? And it just sort of screamed to me that he doesn't really have much of an attacking plan. And maybe, it's a bit guilty of me maybe I'm guilty of, just buying into the hype and, not really watching much of Brentford, meticulously every 90 minutes, and maybe, only sort of when they're in big games and that sort of thing, and not watching them, as extensively enough to know some of the flaws in Thomas Frank's sort of, managerial ability at this level. At least I think he's still a good coach. I think he will easily go on to get another Premier League job and do really well. I just feel like he's just not the right fit for the club, and I'm not going to be screaming from the heavens that he needs to go, because if you're looking at the managerial market now, where do we go? I mean, there's not really an outstanding candidate. I guess the last time we were in this situation, and it was probably, Conte when we went for him, or maybe, I guess it wasn't mid-season, but Pochettino was available before Ange and we didn't get him. But I mentioned it before, we need to find a middle ground with managers. At the minute, we are just either going balls out defensive manager or balls out attacking. We need to find a middle ground, and those sorts of managers do exist. We see it in the Premier League. Eddie Howe, Unai Emery, Fabian Hurtzler, clearly managers who can, adapt and, show both sides of the coin, attacking and defensive wise. Enzo Maresca is probably another one that you'd add to that mix. And I just feel like we're just not the team for Thomas Frank, and he's just not the man to take us where we want to go. And I'm not gonna be, screaming for him out, but I just struggle to see how he gets out of it, and especially with Newcastle away coming up, I really just don't see a way out for him. And it's a bit of a weird place to be in, considering that we've, felt this literally at the end of last season, even, in the lead up to the Europa League with Postecoglou. But I really don't know. But Newcastle away next. It's going to be my first away day for a while. I think since probably Cardiff back in 2019. But I'm saying more in hope than expectation, but I'm hoping that we can see a much better performance from Spurs, and even, 3 points. I mean, chance would be a fine thing, but you know, we'll have to wait and see. But until then, up Spurs.